Hello, my name is Christian Phillips, and for the Fall 2022 Honors Project, my chosen topic is the chip shortage. Today I'll be covering what a chip is, what the shortage is, as well as both the international and domestic impacts both have had on society. And so it's important to note that in 2020, more than 932 billion chips were manufactured around the world, thus feeding a 440 billion euro industry, with 440 billion euros equating to approximately 433 billion United States dollars. So it's no small industry at all. But first and foremost, it's important to break down what a chip is. And so there's two important components of a microchip. You have the chip itself, which refers to the set of electronic circuits that's present on top of the semiconductors, and the semiconductor itself, which is what the electronic circuits are placed on top of. However, for the rest of this presentation, I'll be referring to the completed product as a microchip. And so the second most important component is semiconductors. And simply put, semiconductors possess characteristics of both conductors and insulators. So they can conduct electricity and prevent the conduction of electricity, allowing them to essentially do both depending on what's necessary at the moment. And so, given this diagram, you can see that the production of these microchips is no simple task, really. And it takes quite a bit of time and effort, and I don't intend to go that far in depth with this presentation, and it's not the objective here. What's important to note about microchips, specifically about their function and production, is that they're created to take a human task, a human function, something that we could feasibly do, and translate that into a task that a computer could complete, and do so efficiently such that we can put our own energy towards another task. And so we engage with microchips every single day in such this way. Smartphones most certainly have. Everyone has to carry smartphones, laptops, and PCs, and components of those laptops and PCs. Your CPUs, if you play any games, GPUs, the graphics processing unit, your memory, all of your different types of memory, and even home appliances at this point, which contain such complexity that they now require these chips. Refrigerators, washers and dryers, and automobiles specifically have become increasingly complex, especially with the introduction of electric cars, which require more chips than usual. And so quickly here, a shortage is simply when demand exceeds supply, such that you could see at price level 1, demand has exceeded supply, thus resulting in excess demand, or in other words, a shortage. And so what the chip shortage is not actually a lack of materials. There's no lack of semiconductors or electronic components. It's really just numerous factors that made it so that manufacturers could not keep up with the demand. And as you can note here, it really became a noticeable issue in mid to late 2020, with the COVID-19 pandemic being one of the big issues that led to this shortage, as everyone was forced to work from home, and for a brief period there, everyone was home on quarantine, with the employees at these facilities themselves being home to try and stay safe. And even once we began to try and move back to the way things once were, there was such a heavy reliance on these devices, on smartphones, laptops, for basic things that we needed to now accomplish, that it was far greater than what it typically would have been. And the important thing to note here again is that 90% of the most advanced chips are made in Taiwan, with 75% of the chip production taking place in East Asia. So there's a heavy reliance there on chips from outside of the country, and that's for everyone across the globe relying on Taiwan. And so businesses, especially, were just majorly impacted by this as they saw slowdowns across the board with automobile manufacturers, especially as when you don't have those chips any longer to complete the vehicle, they essentially just had to suspend operations and leave cars sitting on the lots because they no longer had the chips to complete them. And we could see it too with gaming consoles. If you look to try and put in orders for them, you'd note that none really come up, and that's because they don't have the chips necessary to meet that demand for what's the next generation of consoles. Smartphones and the latest televisions are seeing it as well. And so now that we've seen a bit of the larger impacts of the shortage, I thought I would conduct a little survey to see the local impacts of the shortage. And so this survey was limited to students and faculty at Chesapeake College and being intended to generally assess the public's knowledge of the chip shortage and its impacts, regardless of whether they were consciously aware of them or not. And so we can see here that 65% of respondents were aged 40 and up, likely implying that most are employed, as this was limited to Chesapeake College, and as such utilize smartphones and laptops with some level of regularity. So microchips are an essential part of their life. And we can see here again that in spite of 83% having purchased a device within the past 2 years and the shortage hitting its stride in 2020, 78% of respondents had not experienced any trouble purchasing electronics from 2020 to present. And that was quite interesting to me, as I believe that could potentially be indicative of the devices that were purchased not necessarily being major pieces of hardware and perhaps being something on the lower end. And so, in spite of 70% of respondents claiming that they were aware of what the chip shortage is, and only 52% really only knew what a semiconductor was, which indicates to me that there's a bit of surface level awareness. Perhaps you've heard the term beforehand, but aren't quite really aware of what the shortage actually entails. And so there's a lot of common usage in smartphones and PCs specifically, a little bit of gaming consoles in there and vehicles, with most of the respondents driving. However, moving back into the global impacts of the chip shortage itself, we're seeing that nations across the world are taking semiconductor manufacturing far more seriously since this occurrence, as TSMC, the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, produces 53% of the world's chips. And so nations around the world are finally taking steps to try and keep up with this. The United States, China, they're constructing these plans in order to try and make themselves a major power in this industry, so that Taiwan is no longer the sole one that we rely on in this. And so with the future of the chip shortage, things are very uncertain, as when the shortage began in 2020, we saw a lot of CEOs and major news outlets claiming that we would recover in a year. So in 2021, CEOs of those same major manufacturers then said, we were out of the worst of it and we'll recover by 2022. And now here, Intel CEO claims that semiconductor industry will suffer supply shortage until about 2024, but we really don't know. What we do know for certain is that nations are taking these issues seriously. They're taking the semiconductor industry far more seriously and taking steps towards preventing this in the future, as they'll have a bigger hand in this. And that the microchip industry is an essential part of our lives, really. And so, given that microchips are such an essential part of our lives, you have to really consider that in the event of any major event taking place, anything that could potentially take down electronic devices like EMPs or some such, that'd be very worrisome to have a society so dependent on these devices. And yet, smartphones and tablets, computers, having refrigerators which can utilize these microchips, cars, it's a very positive thing that we can have today in order to allow society to continue to function with these devices. And so, at the end of the day, in spite of the chip shortage potentially continuing on for who knows how long, the responses I've received here, with 82, after asking the question, do you believe that semiconductors are important? 82% responded that yes, they do believe semiconductors are important, which indicates to me that the public is aware of the importance of microchips. And with the U.S. government and other nations taking action, we are making progress. And so, with that, that's all you can really hope for. See here my references for this assignment. And so, thank you for your time today.